District of Conservation is sponsored by the Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow, better known as CFACT. To learn more about our sponsor, head over to cfact.org. Thanks for listening to the program. Welcome to District of Conservation. I'm your host, Gabriella Hoffman. This podcast offers a sober examination into all things hunting, fishing, shooting sports, energy, environment, and the public policy surrounding it. And this podcast also specializes in original interviews that you won't hear elsewhere. Here's what I have for you today. As we head into Independence Day, this week, the Senate is now voting on the One Big Beautiful Bill, as I am recording, At this point in time, this afternoon, the last day of June 30th, they're now in the vote-a-rama. The Senate version of the One Big Beautiful Bill passed by a 51-49 vote margin, with 2 Republican senators abstaining. 2 items as it relates to conservation and energy production. We've talked about the public land sales. I want to give an update and my thoughts about that. And also, what is the status of IRA green energy credits? I was actually surprised to see the Senate almost largely stay in line with the House posturing, but you see a couple Republicans who want to keep some IRA green subsidies, even though they didn't vote for the bill. Makes no sense, but they still support this or want to salvage this, probably because of perks and special interests, like anything. Since I had Braxton and Patrick from Rocky Mountain Radio on, a lot has been happening about the public lands provision. I'm pleased to announce that it did not advance into the vote-a-rama, because the attention that the Lee amendment received was extremely negative to the detriment of the senior Utah Senator, Mike Lee. Public lands is where I'm finding myself in disagreement with Senator Lee these days. Not so much opposing enlargements, but I don't agree with the wholesale transfer of public lands. I'm just putting this out there. I've maintained this position, and I'm not changing it. That doesn't mean, however, that I don't acknowledge there is mismanagement of public lands. I don't think supporting public lands means you support mismanagement by the federal government, closing the public lands to access and whatnot. But here is his statement about why he pulled the amendment over the weekend. You probably have seen this if you've been watching this closely like I have. I've spent a lot of time listening to members of the community, local leaders, stakeholders across the country. While there's been tremendous amount of misinformation and in some cases outright lies about my bill, many people brought forward sincere concerns. Because of the strict constraints of budget reconciliation process, I was unable to secure clear, enforceable safeguards to guarantee that these lands would only be sold to American families, not to China, not to BlackRock, not to any foreign interests. For that reason, I made the decision to withdraw the federal land sales provision from the bill. You can read his full statement if you want. I have some disagreements about opposition. Yes, there were certainly opposition from the Greenies, who are not really our friends. They might have some temporary agreement with us here, but you can't really trust them because they will cheer monument enlargements and closures to public lands that diminish access ultimately for us. So I take what they say with a grain of salt. What I saw from my purview and my perch was that it was mostly multi-time Trump voters, very conservative people, cowboys, hunters, ranchers, mining interests, energy production folks, people who have an overlap in many of those fields, industries, what have you, supporters of multiple use, point blank. That came out against this provision because it was not promoting affordable housing. How can you build housing that is so-called affordable in areas that are hard to reach? The language that the amendment had proposed and published did not clarify that, actually added confusion to that. And it's not for affordable housing. Nobody puts Section 8 housing on public lands. The debt and deficit component, even if you were to sell all 640 million acres, which is 28% of total public lands holdings managed by the federal government, there would be very little dent to the debt and deficit because, as I've explained before, as we had Braxton and Patrick discuss, entitlement spending makes up the bulk of our debt and deficit. So you lose access without addressing the root cause of all these financial woes, and that heritage is gone forever. There's already provision if there is to be an allowance or permitting of targeted land sales, which do occur, but they're not very common or very frequent, so to speak. But it's open to the public to decide if you want to dispose of them. But it's a very small provision. It's not really utilized frequently. There is an existing process to do that in FLPMA, the Federal Land and Policy Management Act, which governs multiple use management across BLM, Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, and other related federal lands that are for the public. The Wall Street Journal had talked about it wasn't only 2 to 3 million acres, 0.5 to 0.7 of total holdings. There was even an opening of the door to 250 million acres, or about 40% of the 640 million federal lands that are held across BLM, Forest Service, and the like. So it wasn't just going to be a small percentage of lands deposed, it was going to be almost half. And as the senator admitted, it had nothing to do with reconciliation. This is done by both parties throwing in stuff that is extraneous to the budget reconciliation process, and the sale of public lands thankfully did not pass the smell test here. My contention and problem with this amendment being carried out so far like it was that it will harm efforts to reasonably reform public lands, because now everyone's going to associate any reform with a wholesale transfer or sale of public lands. And that's not what reform, real meaningful reform, should do. And supporting public lands, I want to also mention this, and I'm going to create a video explainer, like a minute or two, for social media, YouTube, elsewhere, explaining myths and truths about public lands, where I will expound on this more. I don't know why people are putting the interests of maintaining access to public lands and calling for greater management against private land conservation efforts. I see those two going hand in hand. I support both types of conservation. I don't think we should be championing one versus the other. With the conservation model we have here in the United States, we welcome both. Majority of lands are primarily held by private interests. There should be some public lands available to regular Americans, because not every person can afford a multi-million-dollar ranch against the backdrop of a national park, BLM, Forest Service lands. You will never 100% privatize federal lands. I don't think that's a smart idea. That does not make me a communist. That doesn't make me a socialist. And when I was seeing those arguments in the discourse about this provision, I could not help but laugh, because my family fled communism. My parents know what socialism is like. And the socialists would not even let you access public lands or some semblance of that. You were barely lucky to even get food on your table and have a house over your head. 90% of your income was taken away. People were living in fear. So part of that was why people did not enjoy nature. And also the central planners were terrible with nature. Only the elite Politburo atop the Communist Party were able to get licenses very feasibly and have prime access to hunting, fishing grounds. Regular people couldn't do that. That was not feasible unless you were politically connected. So I don't see how you can make that connection, because the federal government is overseeing this. We're entrusting the federal government to do this, and we, the public, have access. It's apples and oranges. That you can't make a connection between the two. And trust me, I'm someone who's very distrustful of big government. I don't like central planning. I don't see how you can make that argument here when it is we, the American people, who have the rightful ownership to this, and we should demand of the federal government to manage the lands well, to allow for access, to allow for equal opportunity to lease the lands if you're doing commercial enterprises, and not discriminating people in terms of access, as we have seen the last administration do on millions of acres, shutting down millions of acres to recreational shooting sports, recreational fishing, recreational hunting, and the like. We saw so many million acres lost. We saw more high-intensity wildfires because they were not managing forests as well as they could. A lot of people here on the eastern United States, some of them my friends, bless their hearts, I don't think they have really traversed the West as much. I grew up in California. I see things differently. These lands are also accessible to people in the East. I think that's what they don't understand. You can go there. You should go there and experience it. You could see the good, the bad, and the ugly of public lands, why there needs to be better management. But I think once you explore these areas, even these scrublands and other places that people have deemed suitable for so-called affordable housing, you're never going to see affordable housing there, or any housing. You will see how magnificent public lands are. No place around the world has anything like this, remotely speaking, whatsoever. We're really privileged to have this. And again, because we are such a unique country, we don't have to choose one conservation system over another in terms of public-private partnerships. There's a lot of overlap between the two. You need private individuals, groups, nonprofits to work side by side with the federal government where there is overlap to improve things. Where the federal government can't do something, they can employ federalism to enlist the states and private individuals to come in and help with a solution. We see this a lot with forest management, where there's a lot of red tape and blocking of progress. You can have private actors come in. The same could be said and be done with hunting as a management tool, fishing as a management tool as well. So there are already market mechanisms in place without having to sell federal lands to developers. That's ultimately what this provision would have done. There were no safeguards to even, let's say, entertain selling land to American families. And this whole notion of doing another Homestead Act, I don't know many people who are brave enough or capable enough financially or mentally to homestead. Most people have this idealistic notion of homesteading in areas that are far removed from federal lands, public lands, and they think that they can just up and go and do this, and most of them will not be able to because of the weather conditions, the tough terrain. It's a tough point to make, but it is really true. You can cosplay as a homesteader online, but until push comes to shove and you do this yourself and you realize, oops, you're not cut out for this, maybe you need to be a little careful with proposing a new homesteading act, because most people will not grab onto it. And why do we need the government? We hear these people saying that the federal government is terrible overseeing these lands, but why should the federal government determine who should buy affordable housing on federal lands? Like, isn't that inviting them to encroach even more? Which is why you saw so much opposition to this. So government shouldn't be playing winners and losers for this either, especially with respect to housing being a urban problem. A lot of bad policy making has invited a lot of problems in this area. And I've mentioned before, we have a huge inventory of houses. We actually have 16 million houses available. Why don't you fix what happens in the urban areas before contemplating doing anything here? I think that is why we saw the amendment pulled. I like the middle ground approach. We need better management, better access points. We don't need rewilding or overdevelopment. Those two extremes are really diametrically opposed to multiple use management of public lands. And again, you can support the free markets. You could support public lands access. It's not choosing one or the other. I don't know why everyone is treating this as a zero-sum game. There is some nuance that is deserved here. Use this summer if you have some time and availability to do this and you're wanting to learn about public lands, including BLM, Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife Service lands. Go out west or go to a property here in the eastern United States just to see what this is all about. They really are magnificent places. You can escape the doldrums of your city life. Even for a few hours, there is value to them. They could be better managed. Absolutely. We need more access. Let's do that before inviting a problem such as that has been laid out in Yellowstone. You have to watch Yellowstone very closely because it forewarned us about greedy developers and rewilders. So we need a healthy balance. And that's what following FLPMA and conventional public lands policy, a middle ground, as I've tried to champion here, really will bring. Let's talk about briefly the green energy subsidies. Now, what's the status of that? How much has been removed or kept? I'm still working on understanding the full details, but my understanding from analysis I have seen is that the Senate has largely kept, as they're voting on Votorama right now, a lot of the reforms to sunset, I think even to be more aggressive than the House version I saw as it relates to clean energy production and tax credits relating to solar, wind, EVs. The House version, this is, I think, the top line important thing you need to take away so far from this, in addition to defunding of the Greenhouse Gas Fund and a couple other items as well. And I will link to some of the analysis I've been reading and digesting so you can see for this yourself. But what was really noteworthy so far about this is that subsidies for proposed projects, you have to put them in by the end of 2027, not the end of 2028. So this is even more aggressive than the House version, which I'm pleased to see, because subsidizing mature clean energy industries that can't credibly compete in the market, and they're filing for bankruptcy. There are a lot of companies. Sunnova, I think is the name. It was another solar panel company that has received a lot of federal backing that just recently filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. You're going to see more wind projects canceled because not only do they not have, let's say, backing by the federal government per se, but even the market conditions are moving away from this, especially as rising electricity demand calls for more coal, oil, natural gas, and nuclear. California produces a lot of solar power. They don't know what to do with it in terms of storage, and a lot of it is wasted. So you want to look at a case study of why this won't work. States that supposedly have a handle on this can't even get their act together here. They offset a lot of solar power and let it go to waste in California. I've written about this. If you want to see this example, I'm happy to link to it as well. I want to cite some analysis from Alex Epstein, who has been really leading the charge outside of President Trump to get the senators to not go wobbly on repealing IRA green subsidies. He writes in his Energy Talking Points Substack, the Senate's new budget proposal is a big improvement, but a few changes could make it much better. And he has gotten kind of into, he didn't provoke this, but Senator Tillis, who announced his retirement at the height of the weekend, name dropped him in particular on the Senate floor, saying that he's been an obstacle to keeping so-called good green energy credits. He has an accompanying blog on his conversations and meetings with Tillis. Not surprising, Tillis is going scorched earth here. Now I want to read from Alex's blog about why this is interesting. So he's been engaging with members of Congress on both the House and Senate side. He talks about the different framework. The Senate's new bill goes towards improving the House bill, but it could be significantly better. So I mentioned the placed in service termination deadline for new solar wind subsidies, end of 2027. He says this is a definite achievement because it ensures that its subsidies expire with more than a year remaining of the Trump administration, making it less likely that they will be renewed. He said, note that this proposal still generously protects subsidy for all existing and complete projects, which would already be in construction and would have 2.5 years to be placed in service. This goes a long way to improve upon the House BBB. However, it is worse in certain ways. No commence construction after 60 days requirement, more subsidies for other technologies, carbon capture, battery storage, credit transferability is allowed again, having been repealed in the House bill, special subsidies for large wind solar projects on federal land. What he recommends for strengthening the Senate IRA cuts. For all solar wind projects, adding a firm begin construction requirement of the date of bill's enactment. For ITC, investment tax credit battery storage project, establish a firm placed in service requirement of December 31st, 2027. Close the most egregious and costly loopholes for solar wind battery projects. Cut the subsidy rate to its pre-IRA level in terms of 48E ITC. 10% of project cost, not fair market value. Cease offering the production tax credit on day of enactment. Establish market-based per watt cost caps for solar wind subsidies and cut exorbitant 45X subsidies by 25% and reduce it by 10% a year. He argues that this will save hundreds of billions of additional dollars short-term and trillions long-term, are essential to restore the viability of our grid and lower electricity prices, will still very generously protect subsidies for completed, near-completed projects. You can read more at his Energy Talking Points website to get the wonky details of this. And this could change if the vote-a-rama goes through, but we see a couple Republicans trying to salvage green subsidies, again, even though they did not vote for it, but they think there's going to be some benefits to it should they be kept in place and should these projects come online. But I've long talked about this for the last few months, that most of these projects will fail. Many of these, derivatives are declaring bankruptcy, received loans for promising innovation competitiveness, and then they're now having to file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Make that make sense. We see tech companies, energy companies, a lot of people being realistic and acknowledging that solar and wind cannot credibly compete, not only alone in the market, they can't thrive without subsidies, and even with subsidies, they can barely function, let's be honest. And you see this rising electricity demand. You can thank AI data centers however you feel about them. They've actually been a saving grace, showcasing that so much power demand on the horizon will be met and fulfilled with baseload reliable power such as natural gas and advanced nuclear, coal even as well. Once the final language is sorted out and finalized, or once we get a signing ceremony with all the provisions, the president has been very adamant about repealing green subsidies for mature solar and wind. I will revisit this topic with you here. I know it's been a topic of major discussion for the last few months, but this is very important, even outside of my day job, but for something for all of you to understand. I hope I've tried to make sense of it on both the public lands and also the energy tax credit provisions for you, because it is complex. It shouldn't be complex. The drafters of the IRA made this complex so you wouldn't understand and question it. Now it needs to be broken down very simply to understand why these outstanding credits and subsidies have potentially put us in a very perilous situation. And if they're not undone or repealed, it could spell bad news for meeting this increasing energy demand globally, not even just the United States, but globally too. If you enjoyed this installment of District of Conservation, I would love to know your feedback. Send it my way. Please be sure to leave us reviews on Apple, Spotify, or wherever podcasts are played, and also check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter to never miss a beat nor a guest announcement. Thanks so much for listening to District of Conservation. I hope you have a wonderful day, and please share the podcast to those who may be interested in learning more about these critical natural resources, environment, energy issues.